So welcome again to the Formed Book Club. You have no idea of the technical acrobatics we've had to go through to be able to provide for you this wonderful program. But we're here, and we're continuing with Edward Sri's book, Rethinking Mary in the New Testament by Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute. Last week we covered the first 6 chapters, plus the introduction, I believe. And this week we're going to move on to chapters 7 through 12. Joseph is concerned we may not have enough material to keep a half hour filled, and therefore he's added 3 more chapters of questions. But then you better have prepared, Joseph, because I'm only up to chapter 12.
And so am I.
Okay. Joseph,
I'll just take over at some
I'm
point.
sure you can handle it. So let's go right into chapter 7, the Visitation. Why the haste? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I've got a comment basically on the first couple of pages, if you want me to begin.
Joseph, we'd always love you to begin.
Well, that's always good to know. Obviously, I'm not grounded in either theology or languages, and so what I find very interesting in reading books like this is when Ted Sri brings out the linguistic dimension. So the Mary arose to go to Elizabeth, and then he mentions the Greek word anistanae, which I'm sure I've mispronounced. But then he compares the fact that same word is used in the parable of the prodigal son, who came to his senses and arose to return to his father. And then Levi left everything behind and rose and asked us to follow Jesus. And therefore, when Mary arose to visit Elizabeth, it's to be seen in that context. And then we have the quote from Pope St. John Paul II, page 68, quote, considering that this verb is used in the Gospels to indicate Jesus' resurrection in various parts of Mark and Luke, or physical actions that imply spiritual effort, we can suppose that Luke wished to stress that with this expression, the vigorous zeal which led Mary under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to give the world its Savior. So again, one thing I really love is when someone who understands the linguistic dimension can bring to life, to those of us that don't, how the original Greek actually informs the text in a way that we just read it, in two-dimensional English, so to speak, we don't get that dimension. So I'm very grateful to Ted Sri for bringing that extra dimension to the text for me.
Right, and there's 2 dimensions, really. One is what you mentioned, where he'll show the Greek word where it appears elsewhere in the New Testament, and also in the Greek Old Testament, which is the one that most of the apostles were using when they wrote. So that's the linguistic connection. Then there's also the typological connection between the Old Testament verses, which is also linguistic, but I think it's really helpful to illuminate all these New Testament texts, because I've said many times, it's good to go back and imagine what the joy was of these first Christians as they said, Jesus, this mystery man, begins to appear, and who is he? What is he doing? What does this mean? And is it the Messiah? And they start going back and they reread the Old Testament. Oh my, look at this. This refers to him. I mean, they were making discoveries all the time. And we have the benefit because these books, the Gospels and the letters of Paul, for example, written 20, 30 years or more after the resurrection. And so they've had time to pray on this. Mary's prayed on it. She shared what she's prayed. And so seeing these deep connections, God has his plan in mind, which we only gradually see unfolding. But it's beautiful when someone like Ed Sri can show those connections.
And I love that there's a line from T.S. Eliot I quote all the time, and it's particularly applicable to translation. Between the potency and the existence falls the shadow. And certainly between the potency of the original and the existence of the translation, a shadow falls. So for those of us that haven't had the opportunity, for whatever reason, not at least ineptitude, to read the scriptures in the original language, to have people that have done that illuminate it for us, I think is very helpful.
Mm-hmm. It is
You've
very
been
helpful.
uncharacteristically silent.
Well, he does the same thing with that other phrase that can be translated with eagerness, that her going in haste, this eagerness that she displays also adds something. In other words, she's just not going quickly because she's in some kind of a hurry, but that she's going with this anticipation and enthusiasm and joy, and he brings all this out and links it to the joy of the shepherds after visiting the Christ child and spreading the good news. And so you're right, Joseph, that when he does this with these Greek phrases and words, explains alternate translations, it definitely enriches our understanding and my ability to see the scene. It isn't just a static holy card scene. It reveals more of the interior reality of Mary when he does this.
Right.
And Joseph, you don't have this advantage, but I can look over to Vivian's book, and I notice she has underlined the same things I have. We did not do this together, so that's interesting. Let's go to chapter 8, the Queen Mother. And I want to say that, I've always thought, okay, we have the litany, Queen of Saints, Queen of Apostles, and I think at first the Queen, but of course Christ is the King. I've always thought Christ King, Mary Queen, but it's really she's the Queen Mother, which is a different Old Testament concept, in fact, a different concept in the Eastern world. And all of a sudden things fell into place for me. It's very beautiful.
Yes, it fell into place for me too.
I also like the analogies, which first of all sort of grated with me at the beginning of chapter 8 when Ed 3 actually connects the phrase that when Elizabeth says to Mary, you're blessed among women. And of course, we know as Catholics, blessed art thou amongst women, we say it all the time. But connect it with Jael from Judges and Judith from Judith.
That was great. Oh, that was fantastic. She drives a tent peg through his head.
Exactly. Well, that's the whole point. See, I mean, you think what a weird, because we all have our images of the Blessed Virgin. We cannot imagine the Blessed Virgin driving a tent peg through someone's head or chopping someone's head off, right? I mean, it doesn't actually compute with us. But then, he mentions further down on page 74, the reason for the analogy is that basically this is a prophetic foreshadowing of the Messiah in Genesis 3:15. And of course, in Genesis 3:15, God announces that the first woman, Eve, will have a son, a descendant who will crush the head of the serpent, the devil. And at the bottom of the page there, she, the Blessed Virgin, is the woman whose son will defeat the devil, as Genesis 3:15 foretold, in various parts of scriptures. So the point is that, yes, the Blessed Virgin crushes the head of the serpent. Right? So these prefigurements in the Old Testament, which we think, hang on a second, how's the Blessed Virgin got anything to do with someone who drives a tent peg to the head of someone? Right? And it doesn't really go together. And then you think, yeah, of course, because it's about defeating the devil, right? Defeating evil and doing it by crushing their head. I mean, there's a violent symbolism there, which is necessary because this is a war against Satan, right? It's not about niceties, it's about realities.
And we'll get to this more in the Magnificat, because we say that too every day in the Divine Office, evening prayer. But the Magnificat is a very bellicose, polemical type of prayer. When you think about it, he's cast down the mighty and raised up the lowly and sent the rich away empty. And so, I mean, meek and mild Mary, the mother of Jesus. Well, actually, we got to transpose this to the spiritual realm.
Right. She's not just a Queen Mother, she's a warrior Queen Mother. I like that.
Right. Well, this authority of the Queen Mother that he goes into great detail was very illuminating. Even the idea that the Queen Mother was an intercessor for the people, that the people could take their petitions to her. This really opened my eyes to understanding Mary's role, especially being a convert. The warming up to Mary as an intercessor and praying to her on a regular basis and so on. That took me a long time when I entered the church, but some of this was just so helpful. But Joseph, you really haven't seen anybody do battle with a serpent until you've seen Father Fessio chop the head off of a rattlesnake.
Well, I didn't. Mary wasn't nearby. I had to do it myself.
Well, my Mary was nearby. My Mary saw the snake. And Father rushed into the rescue and vanquished it by chopping off its head. And suddenly, all these scriptural images went whoosh.
I didn't even know that was possible. But you've even got even higher in my estimation, Father.
Yeah.
You
Well,
baffled
thank you.
rattlesnakes.
I want to make one other point here. Is that on page 79, he says, in conclusion, we have seen how the Queen Mother held an official position in the royal court. See, that
Yes.
it's not just, oh, well, she has to be the Queen Mother, but this was a role in the ancient world. And God allowed that role to develop through pagan cultures and then eventually in Jewish culture. Why? So that it could be used now to show the relationship of his mother with his son.
Right.
You know.
And now think of the mother of James and John asking
Yes.
Jesus to give them special positions in the kingdom and so on. I mean, this influence of the mother in our culture, we just, I don't think we really understand this. And this...
except homeschooling moms. I think homeschooling moms, you are one, Vivian, but I met a lot of them. I mean, you want to have someone who's going to fight for their children and fight for the right. I mean, you can't get anybody more vigorous, more intensive, more persistent than homeschooling mom, really.
Well,
as I'm married to a homeschooling mum, I'm obviously going to agree with you there, Father. And the other thing I would say is that,
be careful.
Great minds thinking alike here. I also, the next passage I had highlighted was page 79, the exact paragraph you just quoted, but I'd like to finish it because, again, it's a good summary for those of us that don't know this as well. So in conclusion, we have seen how the Queen Mother held an official position in the royal court, sharing in the shepherding responsibilities of the king and serving as a counselor for the king and as an advocate for the people. I mean, this is a perfect encapsulation of the role of the Blessed Virgin in salvation history and in our own prayer life.
Think especially of the wedding at Cana, right? When she brings this need to the Lord and then says to the people, do whatever he tells you. And this really, this reading this chapter is worth the price of the book, I think.
And not just do whatever he tells you, but actually he says to her, well, my ministry hasn't started yet. In other words, she's jumping the gun, and he allows that.
He allows that.
If that's what you say, Mother, I'll start early.
Yes, right? That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Joseph, several times you mentioned that great minds think alike. But we're not sure that weak minds don't think alike also. And if I look at our present political atmosphere here in the United States, at least on one party, I won't say which one, but it seems to me like weak minds are thinking alike. Anyway, we'll cut that out in case we lose our tax exemption. Chapter 9, the Ark of the Covenant. I hadn't thought about this. I mean, in my 50 years as a Jesuit now. But I mean, what happened to the Ark? You hear these stories about, the lost Ark, in the movie and everything. Well, it turns out, Scripture tells us it was hidden in a mountain by the prophet Jeremiah. That's what the second book of Magnificat tells us. I didn't remember that.
I didn't either. And the people of Ethiopia think they have the Ark there. It's in a shrine.
Really?
Oh, yes. And they trace their religion back to the time when the Queen of Sheba went to visit Solomon, and apparently there was some snishing.
Well,
and then the king of Ethiopia was actually the descendant of Solomon, adopted the Jewish religion. Now, how he obtained the Ark, I don't know. But the people of Ethiopia claim that they have it.
Well, it's true that the Queen of Sheba comes to Solomon asking all these questions. It's so wonderful, but she goes back and she's carrying Solomon's son.
Yes.
That's not exactly mentioned directly in Scripture, but that's what happened. And so Ethiopia is one of the earliest, Jewish communities. And you have the apostles. The strange thing, the eunuch of Queen Candace is in a chariot riding through Palestine, and Philip stops him. What are you reading there? Isaiah. Now, why is the Ethiopian eunuch reading Isaiah unless they become Jewish or at least pro-Jewish?
Right. Yeah, they were already Jewish.
And of course, the eunuch says, how can I understand unless someone show me? And Philip jumps into the chariot, does the exegesis for him, then jumps out and baptizes him. By the way, the view of baptismal preparation in the ancient church was a little different from ours. You didn't need a year full of catechumenate. You just stopped the chariot in front of some water.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily promoting that, but let's not always be following too many
Right. But back to the book, this beautiful image of Our Lady being the Ark of the Covenant, the
Yes.
equivalent of the Ark of the Covenant. And the first time that was ever presented to me is in our own cathedral, because in the shrine
yes.
to Our Lady of Guadalupe, the motif is the burning bush. And then someone was explaining to me all of this Old Testament typography, including the Ark of the Covenant and all these things, which I didn't know anything about this. And here's a whole chapter on the Ark of the Covenant imagery.
Yeah, what leapt out of me as well, the passage I've highlighted from this chapter is on page 88. And again, it's the connection between the Old Testament and the New, how one prefigures the other. And it's the final chapter of that section on page 88. Moreover, just as David leapt and danced before the ark of the Lord, so John the Baptist leaps in Elizabeth's womb when Elizabeth hears Mary's greeting. Finally, both the ark and Mary provoke similar questions. David greeted the ark, saying, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" Elizabeth welcomes Mary, saying, "And why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" So this analogy between David the king and the Blessed Virgin with respect to how they respond to the Ark of the Covenant, I think is Elizabeth and John and David, how they respond to the Ark of the Covenant, and again also Saint John the Baptist leaping in the womb.
Yes,
that analogy with King David is just marvelous.
it is marvelous. That just made me happy.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Well, and going back to page 85, where he quotes 2 Maccabees, where Jeremiah learned of it, he rebuked them and declared, because he says, don't go try and find it. He says, quote, "The place shall be unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. And then the Lord will disclose those things, and the glory of the Lord and the cloud will appear, as they were shown in the case of Moses, and as Solomon asked that the place should be specially consecrated." So basically, don't go find the ark. When the people are gathered together and God comes again, you'll find it. And we did. There is no lost ark anymore. We found it. It's Mary. And he says, what's in the ark? I'm always thinking about, okay, the 10 Commandments, right? But it also has the manna,
Right.
food in the desert, heavenly food, and the rod of Aaron, the priestly, rod. And so,
Right.
bread of life, Christ the high priest, fulfillment of Moses, it's all there.
It's all there, and you can't make this stuff up. You just when you start seeing these connections, there's the temptation to say, "Oh, somebody ferreted all this out and deliberately made it all fit and everything." But no, it's just too much. It's too much. You couldn't possibly do it.
Yeah.
It just is a marvel.
Let's go to chapter 10, the Magnificat, compared with Hannas' Song of Praise. Anybody want to say anything about this?
Well, I actually haven't highlighted anything in this chapter. What I actually found, if I'm to be honest, is that the Magnificat is one of my favorite parts of the whole of Scripture. Everything about it's beautiful, and there's nothing that Ed Sri said that added anything to it for me. But that's just
Really?
my personal aesthetic preferences.
Well, what I took away from this chapter was again that emphasis of Mary standing on behalf of the whole Jewish people.
Yes.
This daughter Zion concept again, even though he doesn't use that expression, but he says that the reversal of fortunes in that canticle of the rich being fled away empty and the poor being fed, all this. And so he says, so what was Mary's affliction? Is she really, apart from the fact that they're occupied by Rome and that they're simple country people and so on. But when he says, quote, this is on 97, her affliction is that of God's people awaiting his saving intervention on their behalf. It emphasized again that she is now this person, not a personification. She's the person to which all of this is happening, but really in order to happen to her entire people and then by extension to all of us.
And that was also a new insight for me of this bond between Mary individually and Mary as the representative of the people, on page 98, he says, the bond between the two halves of the Magnificat makes an important point about the relationship between Mary and God's people. God exalting Mary in her lowliness, first half, foreshadows how God will look with mercy upon the afflictions of all the lowly in Israel, second half. In other words, what God has done for Mary, he's going to do for the rest of his people.
Mm-hmm.
The Magnificat is thus not just about the blessings for Mary, it is about the blessings starting to fall on all the faithful. So that's that same point,
Mm-hmm.
which apparently Joseph already had, in his mind and memory and heart. But for us, it was new, Joseph.
Well, no, what I would really say is that that the Magnificat is so majestic that I found the commentary upon it prosaic in
Okay.
relation to poetry. That's what I'm saying. Doesn't mean it wasn't necessary. Doesn't mean that I could and should have learned more than I did from it.
Okay.
It's just that I was hoping for more because I've elevated that to where it is.
Well, let me say something. I hope this will have a possibility of complementing this majestic view you have of the Magnificat, because of course Magnificat means to make more majestic or to glorify or magnify. But what's always struck me is it begins in Greek, "Hemia psuche," my soul magnifies the Lord. So we have here Mary's psychology. Psychology comes from psuche and logos, right? Study of the soul, study of the human person. And since Mary is the archetype of the merely human person, I mean, her psychology is kind of the archetype of what ours should be.
Mm-hmm.
And so she begins, my soul magnifies the Lord. That's almost like, hey, it's all about me, right? My soul. My spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. Again, there's a tendency for psychology to be very inward looking. But she starts that way. And then what does she do in the second half? And holy is his name. He has shown strength. He has scattered the proud. He has put down the mighty. He has filled the hungry. He has sent empty away. So she's reflecting God. She's looking away from herself. So to me,
I would even say, Father, that my soul magnifies the Lord is herself saying, I am smaller because he is bigger. So right from the very, very beginning, she's basically saying, I'm diminishing because of who he is. It's the lowly in her. And see, what I feel about the Magnificat is, what Chesterton said, no, what Dante's, no, hang on, get this right. What T.S. Eliot said about Dante is that I feel that reading Dante, all I can do is to point and remain silent. And I think with the Magnificat, for me, that's the way I feel. And there was nothing in this chapter which changed my view of that, which, of course, is not saying we should not talk about the Magnificat,
Right.
or that this chapter should not have been written. I'm really talking about my own subjective response to reading it. That's all.
Well, I'm just sorry you're not overwhelmed with joy at my beautiful insight, but that's okay. Maybe some of our viewers and listeners will be.
Well, this understanding that everything that God does for Mary, he's going to do for the rest of us, that continues with all of these other teachings of the church about Mary. For example, her Immaculate Conception. Well, we believe that when we're baptized, we're made pure. And her Assumption. Well, we believe in the resurrection of the body and that someday we too will be united body and soul. So what looks like sort of she's an outlier, these things that happen to her are something beyond the pale and so superhuman and so on. But when you start to see her as representative of yourself and the entire human race, and that everything God does for her, he desires to do for you, you start to look at it in a different way.
Yes, agree.
Chapter 11, Mary at the Nativity. This thing about betrothal, I knew this, but he says it very clearly about the two stages of the Jewish marriage, of betrothal, where you're not living with the woman yet, but you're still committed to her in a permanent relationship. But when you take her to yourself, then begins the consummation of the marriage. That I thought was good.
I agree with you. Bringing that the aspect that the fact that the Bible, the Gospel is still talking about the fact that they're betrothed at this stage. Later on, just before the Nativity, I think was significant. I actually highlighted the passage on page 103 here because I just think it has perennial relevance. at the beginning of that end of that section there, before still betrothed, actually, before we get what we've been talking about, Caesar, in his own show of might with the worldwide census, unwittingly serves the purposes of God.
Mhm.
As a result of Caesar's decree, Mary and Joseph are brought to Bethlehem, and the prophecy is fulfilled as a new king is born in the city of David. And what I love about this, we live in the culture of death. We see the power that's being pressed down upon the church and upon believers, and the persecution, which may well get worse. But we have to realize that in the biggest, wider scheme of things, however powerful Caesar is, and whoever Caesar happens to be in any generation, ultimately Caesar is working to the good, in the sense that God's providence will prevail, and those that are true to that providence, even if they have to suffer even unto death, are ultimately on the winning side. And I think we need to know that, because it's very easy to see the shadows and not actually see the silver lining.
I got something on 109. Do you have something before that, Vivian, you want to mention?
This was one of the things I puzzled over before reading this, and that is that, if Joseph is not the father, then to say that Jesus is the son of David, how does that work? I mean, it's something I puzzled over, but didn't really ever go looking for an answer. But Ed Shree gives us the answer that in adoption, in Jewish adoptions, you actually got everything, the inheritance, the bloodline, the whole shebang. And so by Joseph adopting Jesus as his own son, the Davidic bloodline of Joseph went to Jesus. And so my little puzzle has been put together.
Well, I mean,
Vivian, you've just said exactly what I was going to say next, and I've actually have those passages about the adoption and the Jewish understanding of adoption and what that means.
we're back after a slight technical pause. We're on Mary and the Nativity. I wanted to mention something, Joseph, which is related to something you said earlier in this session, that Edward Shree does this linguistic comparison of things, which enlighten what we're reading about. On page 109, about a third of the way up from the bottom, he says, Luke chooses to focus on how the child was wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger. Luke uses these two verbs back to back only one at a time in his entire gospel. At the end of Jesus' life, where he is taken down from the cross, he was wrapped in the bands of cloth, and he was laid in the tomb. And so, what a connection there between womb and tomb,
I agree. Yep.
Anything else on that chapter?
Not for me.
Chapter 12 here, which is Mary at the presentation. Vivian, anything?
Well, yes, this point that I never have seen explained before, that instead of this firstborn son needing to be redeemed, which is what they would do, because the firstborn son was supposed to be given to God. So you'd bring him to the temple and then you buy him back, so to speak. But Jesus, in fact, is simply given to God. And I just didn't know that. There's so many things I'm learning in this book. I love when I read a book and I learn so much.
What I love also, page 117 in this chapter, this background tells us something important about Mary and Joseph. The fact that they offer a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons indicates that they are poor. They cannot afford a lamb for the sacrifice, which is what they should give. But, and again, this is the wonderful poetic divine symmetry right at work in salvation history. Nevertheless, they have something much more valuable to present to the Lord. As Pope St. John Paul II has pointed out, they bring to the temple the true lamb, the child Jesus, who will redeem humanity through his sacrifice on the cross. So they can't afford to bring a symbolic lamb, if you like, to sacrifice. They bring the real lamb himself. Marvelous.
With that, unless there's a last word from Vivian,
No.
we will conclude this week's session and hope to see you next week. God bless you all.